Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm glad you're joining me today because we have a really fascinating and disturbing story coming up in American criminal history. Today, we're going to take a look together at one of the most mysterious serial murder cases that still raises questions and leaves investigators wondering. We'll be talking about the Connecticut River Valley Killer, an unknown killer who terrorized the Connecticut River Valley region on the borders of Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire between 1978 and 1988. Over the decade, this mysterious perpetrator claimed at least 7 victims, mostly young women between the ages of 17 and 38. What makes this case so special is not just the brutality of the acts, but more importantly, the fact that it remains unsolved after more than 30 years. Although the police have had the testimony of a single survivor, forensic evidence, and psychological profiles, the perpetrator has never been caught. The Connecticut River Valley area was transformed into a place of fear where women were afraid to walk alone and local communities lived in constant tension. Today, we'll try to unravel what we know about this case, what the main theories are, and why it remains unsolved to this day. If you're interested in real crimes and unsolved cases, be sure to subscribe and turn on your notification bell. Let's get started. Now let's take a closer look at the individual victims of this mysterious killer. Each of these women had a story, dreams, and loved ones who are still searching for answers today. Catherine was an avid nature photographer and loved birdwatching. On October 24, 1978, she left her job in New London, New Hampshire, with the intention of photographing birds at Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve. It was an area she knew well, and where she often went to pursue her hobby. Kathy was a responsible woman who always kept her loved ones informed of her plans, so when she didn't return home, the search was immediately launched. Her body was found the next day. Kathy had suffered more than 20 stab wounds, indicating the extreme brutality of the attack. The crime scene was in a remote area of wetlands that would be difficult for a casual passerby to reach. This first case laid the groundwork for what later turned out to be a series of similar crimes. Mary was a student at the University of Vermont, and on July 25, 1981, she was last seen hitchhiking near Interstate 91 on the Vermont-Massachusetts border. She was a middle-aged woman who had decided to complete her education later in life, a decision that required courage and determination. Mary had clear plans for that day, and her sudden disappearance was shocking to her family and friends. Hitchhiking was a more common form of transportation at the time, especially among students, but Mary was cautious and experienced. Her remains were not found until several months later, making it difficult to determine the exact cause of death and collect forensic evidence. Bernice was the youngest victim in this series. On May 30, 1984, she was last seen hitchhiking on New Hampshire Route 12 in Claremont. She was a teenager with her whole life ahead of her, probably traveling to visit friends or family. Her case was particularly tragic, not only because of her young age, but also because of the time that had passed before her remains were found. Bernice had been missing for 2 years before her remains were found near Newport, New Hampshire. The long time between her disappearance and the discovery of her body meant that most of the physical evidence was lost or degraded. Heidi was even younger than Bernice, just 16 years old. On the 20th of May, 1984, she went out for a run in Hartland, Vermont, an activity she regularly performed and which was part of her daily routine. Heidi was an active girl who cared about her health and fitness. Her body was found the next day in a swampy area near Hartland Elementary School. The fact that she was found so quickly provided investigators with more forensic evidence than some of the other victims. Heidi represented the type of young, healthy woman the perpetrator apparently targeted. Ellen was last seen on July 22, 1984, using a telephone booth in Claremont, New Hampshire. She was on the phone to someone close to her, indicating that she did not feel in danger. Ellen was a woman in her prime who was probably dealing with some everyday issue. Her remains were not found until a year later near Kellyville, New Hampshire. The long time between the disappearance and the discovery of the body again made the investigation and evidence collection difficult. Ellen represented the type of woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but her death was not accidental. She fit a pattern that was beginning to emerge. Eve disappeared on July 10, 1985, while hitchhiking on Route 12 in Charlestown, New Hampshire. She was a woman of a similar age to several of the previous victims, reinforcing the theory that the perpetrator had specific preferences about his targets. Her remains were found in 1986 near Kellyville, New Hampshire, the same area where Ellen Freed was found. This geographic grouping became an important part of the investigation and helped investigators better understand the perpetrator's movement patterns and preferred areas. Linda represented a different pattern of attack. On April 15, 1986, she was fatally stabbed in her own home in Saxtons River, Vermont. Unlike most of the other victims, she was not found in a remote area, but was murdered in an environment where she felt safe. Linda died as a result of multiple stab wounds, which was consistent with the manner of attack for the other victims. Her case showed that the perpetrator was willing to change his modus operandi and that no place was truly safe. The fact that he had penetrated her home suggested a growing complacency and possible escalation of violence. Barbara was the oldest of the victims, and on January 10, 1987, she was returning from a ski trip in Vermont. It was something she did regularly, a healthy activity she enjoyed. Barbara represented an active, middle-aged woman who lived a full life. Her car was found at a rest stop, but her body was not discovered until months later near Hartland, Vermont. The circumstances of her disappearance indicated that she was likely forced to abandon her vehicle, suggesting that the perpetrator was able to coerce his victims into compliance either through trickery or force. Each of these women left behind family, friends, and unresolved issues. Their stories form a mosaic of a tragedy that spanned decades and is still seeking resolution. Now, let's take a close look at the way the Connecticut River Valley killer operated. His method was very specific and pointed to a premeditated perpetrator who had a clear pattern of behavior. The perpetrator displayed an extraordinary knowledge of the terrain of the Connecticut River Valley and systematically sought out locations that gave him tactical advantages. His preference was to target remote wooded areas that were far enough away from major thoroughfares, yet accessible by car or on foot. Of particular interest was his repeated use of certain locations. The area around Kellyville, New Hampshire, became his favorite place to dump bodies. Several victims were found within just 300 meters of each other. This behavior indicated that he scouted the sites in advance and chose locations where he was certain not to be disturbed in his actions. The perpetrator also showed a preference for locations near watercourses, particularly smaller tributaries of the Connecticut River. These locations provided him with several advantages: natural sound masking through the gurgling of the water, a moist environment that accelerates the decomposition of biological traces, and difficult-to-access terrain that deterred casual passers-by. Forest paths and deserted dirt tracks were another category of his preferred locations. These roads were wide enough for him to drive a car to them, but at the same time not frequented, so the risk of detection was minimal. The perpetrator had clearly spent time studying maps or personally surveying the area, as his choice of locations showed a systematic approach and local knowledge. The perpetrator's method of killing was brutal and personal. While some of the victims were strangled, most died as a result of multiple stab wounds inflicted by the knife. These attacks were extremely violent and often went beyond what was necessary to kill the victim, suggesting sadistic tendencies or a loss of control at the time of the act. Forensic analyses revealed that the stab wounds exhibited similar characteristics across the different cases: depth, angle of penetration, and pattern. This suggested the use of the same type of weapon, probably a hunting or kitchen knife with a fixed blade approximately 10 to 15 centimeters long. The wounds were often concentrated on vital areas: the neck, chest, and abdomen, indicating the perpetrator's knowledge of human anatomy or experience with similar attacks. Particularly disturbing was the perpetrator's ritualistic element of removing souvenirs from his victims. In addition to cutting off strands of hair, he sometimes took nails or small personal items. This behavior is typical of serial killers who need to preserve a physical memory of their crime. Hair and nails are biological material that retain certain characteristics of the victim even after death, and for the perpetrators they represented a way to own part of their victim after the attack was over. In some cases, traces have been found of the perpetrator having spent an extended period of time at the crime scene, This behavior suggested that he was savoring his actions and perhaps performing other ritualistic activities that were not forensically detectable. Spending a long time with the victim also increased the risk of detection, indicating the perpetrator's complacency or the compulsive nature of his actions. One of the most characteristic features of the perpetrator's method was the manner in which he disposed of the bodies of his victims after the murder. Unlike many serial killers who try to hide or destroy evidence, the Connecticut River Valley killer simply left the bodies of his victims at the scene or moved them to nearby locations where they were left lying loose on the surface. This behavior had several dimensions. First and foremost, it showed the perpetrator's arrogance or lack of fear of capture. Not hiding the bodies greatly increased the likelihood of their rapid discovery, which should lead to more intensive investigations. Yet the perpetrator chose to proceed in this manner, indicating either his belief in his own inviolability or his desire for attention. The method of disposing of the bodies also betrayed some element of respect or ritual. The bodies were not thrown or dishonored after death. They were laid in relatively dignified positions, sometimes even arranged to look as if the victim was asleep. This element suggested a complex psychological profile of the perpetrator, who combined extreme violence with some form of care for his victims after their deaths. The locations where the bodies were dumped were chosen so that they would eventually be found, but not immediately. The perpetrator placed them far enough away from the main roads so that a casual passerby would not discover them immediately, but also in areas that were occasionally frequented by mushroom pickers, tourists, or local residents. This timing gave him time to escape, but also ensured that his work would be discovered and receive media attention. The absence of any attempt to cover or bury the bodies also facilitated the decomposition and loss of forensic evidence. Exposure of the bodies to weather, animals, and natural processes quickly degraded biological clues that could lead to identification of the perpetrator. This fact suggested that the perpetrator understood forensic procedures and consciously chose strategies that minimized the risk of his capture through scientific evidence. Let us now take a detailed look at how the investigation of this complex case, which posed a challenge to forensic science at the time, was conducted. The investigation of the Connecticut River Valley killer became one of the first cases to require the coordination of police forces across state lines in the northeastern United States. Local police departments in New Hampshire and Vermont quickly realized that these were not isolated crimes, but systematic attacks by a single perpetrator. The New Hampshire State Police took the lead in coordinating the investigation because most of the bodies were found in their territory. They created a special unit dedicated solely to this case to link all available information from the various crime scenes. This unit worked in close cooperation with the Vermont police, especially when it came to exchanging information about missing persons and new finds. The FBI was involved in the case primarily in an advisory capacity. In the 1980s, today's protocols for automatic involvement of federal agents in serial killer cases did not yet exist, but their expertise in criminal profiling was very valuable. Federal agents provided technical support in analyzing offender behavior patterns and assisted with the development of psychological profiles. Coordination between the agencies was not always seamless. Each department had its own procedures, filing systems, and priorities. Information was exchanged mostly through phone calls and physical transfer of documents, which sometimes led to delays or misunderstandings. Nevertheless, a workable network of communication was established that allowed key observations and evidence to be shared. Particular emphasis was placed on creating a common database of missing persons and unsolved cases from across the region. Detectives systematically searched through old files for cases that could be linked to the main series of murders. This process uncovered several other suspicious deaths that were subsequently incorporated into the broader investigation. The 1980s represented a transitional period in forensic science. Traditional methods such as dactyloscopy and blood trace analysis still formed the basis of investigations, but the first advanced techniques were beginning to emerge, including an early form of DNA analysis. The New Hampshire State Police Dactyloscopic Unit made an enormous effort to process all fingerprints found at crime scenes. The problem was that most of the sites were exposed to the weather for long periods of time, which greatly degraded the quality of the prints. Nevertheless, several partial prints were secured from the personal effects of the victims and from surfaces that the perpetrator may have touched. The comparison of the prints was carried out manually using magnification systems and classification schemes. Each new print had to be compared against thousands of samples in the archives, a very time-consuming process. Special teams of technicians were created to devote themselves exclusively to this task, but the results often did not yield concrete clues. The analysis of the blood samples focused primarily on determining blood groups and basic characteristics. Forensic laboratories were able to distinguish the blood of the perpetrator from that of the victim when mixed samples were found, and could identify some genetic markers available at the time. This information provided a basic profile of the perpetrator but was not specific enough to identify him. In the late 1980s, the first forms of DNA analysis, known as RFLP, restriction fragment length polymorphism, became available. These tests required relatively large quantities of well-preserved biological material, and the analysis process took several weeks. Investigators experimented with this technology on samples from the best-preserved crime scenes, but the results were often inconclusive due to sample degradation. One of the biggest challenges of the entire investigation was the lack of good-quality physical evidence. The perpetrator's choice of remote locations and his method of depositing the bodies in the open meant that most forensic clues were destroyed by the weather before the bodies were discovered. The dispersion of the crime scenes across a large geographical area made coordination of the investigation difficult. Each site fell under a different jurisdiction, had different climatic conditions, and was discovered at different times after the murder. This fragmentation led to inconsistent evidence collection and varying standards of forensic processing. The lack of reliable witnesses was another major problem. Because the perpetrator operated in remote areas and often at night, there were very few people who could have seen him. Several witnesses reported sightings of suspicious vehicles or persons in relevant areas, but their accounts were often contradictory or too vague to provide concrete clues. Psychological pressure on local communities also complicated information gathering. People were afraid to talk openly about their sightings for fear of becoming the next victim. Some potential witnesses refused to cooperate with the police because they feared retribution or did not want to be involved in such a serious case. The media attention that developed around the case had a twofold effect. On the one hand, it raised public awareness and led to more tips, but on the other hand, it also attracted a lot of false testimony and misleading information. Investigators have had to devote considerable time and resources to verifying these tips, which has distracted from the real leads. The technological limitations of the time also hindered the efficient processing of information. There were no computerized databases to quickly search and collate data, which meant that all analysis had to be done manually. Communication between the various agencies was mainly by telephone and postal services, which slowed down the exchange of important information. Time pressure and public expectation of a quick resolution of the case also affected the quality of the investigation. Detectives were under tremendous pressure to produce quick results, sometimes leading to hasty conclusions or overlooking important details. Political pressure from the highest levels of government added another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. Let us now take a close look at the profile of the perpetrator, which was created by criminologists and psychologists based on an analysis of his behavior and patterns of behavior. Expert analysis of the perpetrator's geographical patterns of behavior revealed a fascinating picture of his possible environment and routines. Geographic profiling, which was just developing as a scientific discipline in the 1980s, suggested that the offender had a deep knowledge of a particular area along the Connecticut River. An analysis of distances between crime scenes indicated that the perpetrator operated in a relatively compact area approximately 80 miles in diameter, centered somewhere in the area of the New Hampshire-Vermont border. This concentration suggested that he had a home turf in this area, a place where he felt safe and where he knew every road, every forest, and every secluded spot. Particularly significant was the observation that all of the crime scenes were within a 30-minute drive of major traffic arteries, yet sufficiently isolated from populated areas. This combination suggested that the perpetrator either lived in the area itself or visited it regularly for work or personal reasons. Geographers and crime analysts noted that the offender showed a preference for certain types of terrain, wooded areas with dense undergrowth, locations near waterways, and areas with natural hiding places such as boulders or dense brush. These preferences indicated possible experience with outdoor activities, hunting, or military service. Analysis of temporal patterns revealed that the perpetrator was most familiar with traffic rhythms in the area, attacking at times when the probability of accidental discovery was lowest, but also at times when his own movements in the area did not raise suspicion. This suggested that he was a local resident or a person with a legitimate reason to travel regularly through the area. FBI profiler Greg McCrary and other experts created a detailed psychological profile that revealed a complex personality with serious pathological traits. The perpetrator exhibited traits of territorial behavior typical of certain types of serial killers. He considered the Connecticut River Valley area to be his hunting territory. Psychological analysis indicated a male between the ages of 25 and 40 during a period of active attacks, placing him in the category of organized serial killers with a high degree of self-control and planning. His ability to evade capture for over a decade was indicative of above-average intelligence and the ability to learn from mistakes. Analysis of patterns of violence revealed a gradual escalation of brutality, which is typical of serial killers who need increasingly intense stimulation to achieve psychological gratification. The perpetrator showed signs of sadistic tendencies. The attacks often went beyond what was necessary to kill the victim, suggesting that he enjoyed the violence and needed to feel absolute control over his victims. Ritualistic elements of his behavior, such as removing souvenirs from his victims, suggested a compulsive disorder and a need to relive his actions through physical mementos. This behavior is characteristic of killers with narcissistic personality traits who need to constantly reaffirm their power and dominance. Psychologists have identified likely problems in interpersonal relationships, particularly with women. The selection of exclusively female victims and the way he treated them suggested a deep-seated misogyny and possible traumatic experiences with female authority figures at an early age. The profile also suggested an ability to function in a normal social setting. The perpetrator was likely able to maintain employment, perhaps even relationships, and outwardly appear as a normal member of the community. This mask of normality is typical of organized serial killers who are able to separate their criminal identity from their public persona. Several independent witnesses from different locations and time periods have provided similar descriptions of a vehicle that could belong to the perpetrator. These statements became a key part of the profile in the search operation. The most frequently mentioned vehicle was a white or light gray smaller passenger car, probably a compact sedan or hatchback from the late 1970s or early 1980s. Witnesses described the vehicle as ordinary and unremarkable, the type of car that would not attract attention in a rural setting. One witness gave a more detailed description. The vehicle probably had 2 doors, dark glass, and was in relatively good condition, suggesting that the offender had cared for his car or had the means to maintain it. The lack of significant damage or modifications supported the theory that the perpetrator was trying to remain inconspicuous. Several witnesses noted that the vehicle had been spotted near where the victims were later found, but within a time interval of several days before the discovery of the bodies. This observation supported the theory that the perpetrator had scouted the sites in advance and returned to them repeatedly. Of particular interest was the testimony that described the driver as a man of medium build, with dark hair who sat very upright at the wheel. The witness noted that the man appeared to be nervous or alert, frequently checking his rearview mirrors and surroundings. Analysis of the vehicle's observation patterns revealed that it was most often seen in the early morning or late evening hours, which was consistent with the offender's mode of operation. The vehicle was also frequently seen on secondary roads or on the outskirts of smaller villages, never in the center of larger towns. Technical analysis of tire tracks from several crime scenes confirmed the use of standard tires common on smaller passenger vehicles. The tread pattern matched the marks normally used on mid-range vehicles, which supported the witness's testimony about the type of vehicle. The police developed an extensive database of vehicles matching this description registered in the New England area and systematically screened their owners. This process involved thousands of vehicles and their owners, but did not yield a specific suspect that matched all aspects of the offender profile. Now let's take a close look at the key evidence that investigators gathered over the years that formed the basis of their search for the Connecticut River Valley killer. The forensic teams paid extraordinary attention to the collection and analysis of fingerprints from the crime scenes, despite facing significant challenges. Most sites were exposed to the weather for long periods of time, which led to degradation of biological traces and made it difficult to identify usable prints. The most promising finds came from hard surfaces such as rocks, metal objects, or remnants of packaging that the perpetrator may have held in his hands during his actions. Technicians used special powder techniques and iodine vapor to highlight latent prints, but success rates were limited due to weather conditions and the time that elapsed between the crime and the discovery of the site. One of the most significant finds was a partial thumbprint found on a plastic container that was likely left by the perpetrator. This print was of sufficient quality for comparison, but no match was found after searching all available databases. The print was catalogued and became a reference sample for future comparisons with the suspects. Hair traces represented another category of evidence that required careful analysis. Forensic laboratories were able to distinguish hair belonging to the victims from that which may have come from the perpetrator based on microscopic analysis of texture and pigmentation. Several unidentified hairs found on or near the victim's clothing were subjected to detailed examination. Analysis of the hair samples revealed that the unidentified hair came from a Caucasian male with dark hair. Microscopic characteristics indicated an age of approximately between 30 and 40 years at the time of the attacks. This hair also showed signs of chemical treatment, possibly dyeing or the use of hair products, which provided further clues about the perpetrator's lifestyle. A systematic search of the areas around the crime scenes revealed scattered personal items belonging to the victims, which provided important information about the course of the attacks and the perpetrator's behavior. These findings suggested that the attacks did not take place in one location, but that the perpetrator was likely to have moved his victims around, or that fighting occurred during the attack. Pieces of torn clothing were found at various distances from the main crime scenes, sometimes up to several hundred meters away. The distribution of these fragments indicated the direction of movement during the attack and provided information on how long the attack may have lasted. Forensic analysis of the manner in which the clothing was torn revealed the use of a sharp instrument, probably a knife, which was consistent with the manner in which the victims were injured. Personal jewelry was a particularly valuable category of evidence. Several earrings, bracelets, and rings were found separate from the bodies, often in various stages of damage. Some of the jewelry showed traces of blood which, when analyzed, matched the blood types of the victims. An interesting observation was that expensive jewelry was often left in place, suggesting that the motive was not robbery. Cosmetic items such as lipsticks, mirrors, or combs were found scattered around the crime scenes. These items often bore the victim's fingerprints, but also unidentified prints that could have come from the perpetrator. Analysis of the distribution of these items provided information on whether the victims had attempted to defend themselves or flee. Special attention was paid to the findings of personal documents. Driver's licenses, credit cards, or photographs were sometimes found separate from wallets, indicating that the offender was viewing or sorting through these items. Some documents showed signs of tampering, as if the offender wanted to keep them but ultimately decided to abandon them. Over the years of the investigation, police received hundreds of tips from citizens, some of which provided consistent descriptions of a suspect who might be the perpetrator. This information, while never fully confirmed, painted a relatively consistent picture of a possible suspect. There were repeated descriptions of a man of medium build who was seen in areas near the crime scenes carrying a large hiking backpack or sports bag. Witnesses described the backpack as dark-colored, possibly green or brown, and appeared to be heavy or contain solid objects. The man was always alone and moved quickly and efficiently, as if he knew the terrain well. Several witnesses independently described the man's distinctive voice, a deeper, raspy voice with a possible regional accent characteristic of the New England area. One witness stated that the man was talking to himself or perhaps into a portable radio, which was not as common in the 1980s and may have indicated a particular occupation or hobby. In appearance, he was described as a man between the ages of 25 and 40, with dark hair and a height of about 175 centimeters. He had a robust build but was not obese, rather muscular or compact. Several witnesses noted that he wore dark glasses, although it was unclear whether these were dioptric glasses or sunglasses. Clothing was described as practical outdoor gear: dark pants, possibly jeans or outdoor pants, and a dark jacket or sweater. Footwear was always described as sturdy, probably hiking boots or work boots suitable for moving around in the field. This clothing fit the profile of a person who spends time outdoors and is prepared for a variety of weather conditions. The temporal patterns of this person's observations were particularly interesting. The man was most often seen in the early morning hours or at dusk, often during periods that preceded the discovery of the bodies by several days. This timing supported the theory that the perpetrator had scouted the sites in advance and planned his actions in advance. Behavioral characteristics described by witnesses included nervous or alert behavior, frequent looking around, and a tendency to avoid direct eye contact with other people. The man appeared to be familiar with the area and was certainly moving along less familiar trails and forest roads. Now let's look at the various theories and speculations that have developed around the Connecticut River Valley killer case over the years of the investigation, and which continue to fuel discussions among criminalists and the public to this day. One of the most commonly discussed theories focused on a possible connection to other serial killers operating during the same time period. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, was active during a similar time frame on the west coast of the United States, leading some theorists to speculate on a possible connection. This theory was based on several observed similarities. Both offenders targeted young women, both operated for long periods of time without being caught, and both exhibited the characteristics of an organized serial killer with a high degree of planning. Some speculators have suggested that they could be the same person who traveled across the continent, or two perpetrators who were in contact and shared techniques. However, more detailed analysis revealed major differences in modus operandi that cast doubt on this theory. While the Green River Killer primarily targeted sex workers and used mostly strangulation, the Connecticut River Valley Killer selected a more diverse range of victims and favored stabbing weapons. The geographic distance between locations of operation was also a significant obstacle to this theory. Other speculation has focused on possible connections to smaller regional serial killers operating in the New England area. Similarities to unsolved murders in neighboring states were explored, including cases in Maine and Massachusetts that exhibited some similar characteristics. However, these analyses did not yield concrete evidence of a link. Particular attention has been paid to the traveling killer theory, the offender who could be a trucker, a business traveler, or a person with another job requiring frequent travel. This theory sought to explain the geographic distribution of acts and the long time intervals between some attacks. One of the most complex debates in the investigation revolved around the question of whether the perpetrator was a local resident of the area or a person merely visiting the area for work or other reasons. Each of these theories had strong arguments and implications for investigative strategies. The local resident theory was based primarily on the perpetrator's detailed knowledge of the terrain and his ability to select isolated locations that would be unfamiliar to a person who only occasionally visits the area. The perpetrator exhibited familiarity with local traffic patterns, seasonal changes in tourism, and the best times to move inconspicuously in the area. Also supporting this theory was the consistency in the geographic distribution of the acts. All the locations were in a relatively compact area, suggesting a home territory for the offender. Local knowledge of forest paths, hidden access points, and natural hiding places would be difficult for an outside visitor to access without long-term reconnaissance. The traveling perpetrator theory relied on observations of long intervals between some attacks that could correspond to work cycles or travel patterns. This hypothesis suggested that the perpetrator could have been a trucker, a business traveler, or even military personnel who regularly visited the area as part of their duties. The travel theory also explained why the perpetrator was able to evade capture. He may have left the area for long periods after each series of attacks, making it difficult for locals to build a profile of him. His knowledge of the terrain could have come from previous visits, perhaps from his childhood or recreational activities. The hybrid theory combined both approaches and suggested that the perpetrator may have been a former local resident who later moved away but returned to the area regularly. This theory explained both the intimate knowledge of the terrain and the irregular temporal patterns of attacks, psychological analysis of the perpetrator's motivations revealed a complex pattern of motives that combined several typical features of serial killers. Sexual violence appeared to be the primary motivation, but not in the traditional sense. The attacks showed signs of sadistic satisfaction from dominating and controlling the victim. Analysis of the manner of the attacks suggested that achieving absolute power over their victims was key for the perpetrators. The brutality of the attacks often exceeded the level necessary to kill, indicating sadistic tendencies and a need to prolong the victim's suffering. This behavior is characteristic of killers who derive primary satisfaction from the process of killing rather than the outcome. The offender's collecting behavior, removing hair, nails, and personal items, represented an additional layer of motivation. These souvenirs served as physical mementos that allowed the perpetrator to relive his actions in private. Psychologists have interpreted this behavior as a manifestation of narcissistic personality disorder and the need to own a part of their victim even after their death. Theories about the ritual aspects of motivation focused on the way the perpetrator disposed of the bodies after the murder. The absence of post-mortem sexual abuse and the relatively dignified disposal of the bodies suggested a complex psychological dynamic where violence was combined with some form of reverence or ritual behavior. Motivational analysis also explored possible triggers for the perpetrator's actions. Some theories suggested that the attacks may have been triggered by life stressors, such as relationship problems, job loss, or the anniversary of traumatic events in the perpetrator's past. The temporal distribution of some attacks supported the hypothesis of the cyclical nature of his compulsions. Another line of speculation focused on possible misogynistic motivation. The perpetrator's selection of exclusively female victims and the way he treated them suggested a deep-seated hatred or fear of women. This motivation may have stemmed from traumatic experiences with a mother, partner, or other significant female figure in the perpetrator's life. The complexity of the motivational structure also included possible elements of territoriality. The perpetrator may have considered the Connecticut River Valley area as his hunting territory, and the murders may have been a way of marking that territory. This behavior is typical of certain types of serial killers who need to feel control over a specific geographic area. Now, let's take a look at the current status of the case and how you, as viewers, can contribute to its possible resolution. In the year 2024, the Connecticut River Valley killer case has once again taken center stage thanks to new investigative efforts that utilize state-of-the-art forensic technology. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office confirmed that the current investigative steps are the result of several years of subsequent investigation and analysis by investigators, indicating a systematic reevaluation of all available evidence using current methods. The most important advancement in the field of forensic science is the development of advanced DNA analysis techniques that far exceed the capabilities of the 1980s. Current technology allows the extraction of usable DNA even from extremely degraded samples that were previously considered unanalyzable. Methods such as STR analysis, short tandem repeat, and mitochondrial DNA sequencing can provide a genetic profile even from decades-old biological traces. Genetic genealogy is a revolutionary tool that combines traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research. This method has been successfully used to solve dozens of cold cases, including the Golden State Killer. The process involves uploading the DNA profile of the perpetrator to public genealogical databases and then creating a family tree that can lead to the identification of suspects. Databases such as GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and others contain millions of genetic profiles of volunteers, greatly increasing the likelihood of finding a genetic match or close relatives of the perpetrator. These databases are constantly expanding, meaning that even profiles that show no match today may provide key connections in the future. Advanced algorithms for analyzing mixed DNA samples allow the separation of genetic profiles from biological traces that contain DNA from multiple individuals. This technology is particularly valuable in cases where mixed samples of blood or other body fluids have been found at a crime scene. Current laboratories also use a technique called touch DNA, which can extract usable genetic information from even a minimal amount of biological material, just a few cells left by touch. This method could be applied to victims' personal items or surfaces that may have been touched by the perpetrator. More than 35 years after the last confirmed attack, the Connecticut River Valley killer likely remains alive. Statistics show that serial killers of this type have a life expectancy comparable to the general population, meaning that the perpetrator could be in his 70s or 80s today. Modern communication technologies and social networks have created unprecedented opportunities for sharing information and linking observations from different periods and locations. Information that might have seemed irrelevant in the 1980s can now, in the context of all the observations collected, provide a crucial link. The importance of civic cooperation is particularly evident in the area of family memories and orally transmitted information. Children and grandchildren of people who lived in the area during the 1980s may have access to family stories, photographs, or documents that were never passed on to the police. This information may include key details about suspicious people or unusual events from that time. Witnesses from the original period have now reached an age where they may be more willing to share information they previously withheld out of fear, loyalty, or other personal reasons. The time lapse may also help in equipping them with details that were suppressed at the time of stress or trauma. Technological advances in communication allow for anonymous information sharing through dedicated helplines or online platforms. This anonymity can encourage people who had information but were afraid to share it because of the potential consequences. Genealogical research conducted by amateur genealogists may reveal family connections or patterns that have escaped the attention of professional investigators. Volunteers working on genealogy projects often have access to historical records and archival materials that can provide new perspectives on a case. Fellow viewers, your voice and your attention can play a key role in the ultimate resolution of this case. Every sharing of this video increases the likelihood that information will reach the person who has a key observation or memory that may change the direction of the investigation. If you like the content on my channel and want to support shining a light on unsolved cases, be sure to subscribe and turn on your notification bell. Your subscription allows me to continue researching and presenting these important stories that deserve attention and not to be forgotten. In the comments below this video, I'm interested in your own theories and thoughts on the case. Perhaps you have a perspective or idea that has not yet been explored. Discussion in the comments may inspire further research or bring new angles to familiar information. Each constructive theory contributes to the larger discussion and may contain a grain of truth. If you have specific information related to the case, whether it be personal recollections, family stories, or any observations from the New Hampshire and Vermont area in the 1980s, please contact the investigating authorities directly. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office has a special cold case hotline where you can share any relevant information anonymously. Remember, even seemingly small details can make a huge difference. Maybe your grandfather or grandmother mentioned something unusual from that time. Maybe you have old photos from the area, or maybe you remember a strange neighbor. All of this information can add to the big picture and help investigators put together the missing pieces of the puzzle. Sharing this video on social media can reach people who lived in the area during the 1980s and who live all over the world today. Modern technology allows us to connect information in ways that were not possible at the time of the original investigation. Your sharing can be the step that finally brings justice to the victims and their families. Thank you for your attention and for helping to keep these cases in the public eye. Together, we can ensure that the Connecticut River Valley killer will not forever escape justice.